So now I'm going to bring in to the spotlight our guest of honor tonight, and that is Ira Rosen. We're so excited to have him here tonight, and I'm so excited to be interviewing. And I told them a little bit earlier, I'm actually I'm more nervous about this interview than any that I've done. And you all know I've done a lot of them, but to be interviewing someone who's worked with the best interviews in the world is a little bit intimidating, but I'm going to give it my best shot tonight. So let me tell you all a little bit more about Ira. So he began his career at 60 Minutes when he was just 26 years old. He was the youngest producer of the most popular show in America. And over the next 40 years, he would be at the center of more historical and groundbreaking stories than most journalists would experience in 10 lifetimes. He has won every major award in broadcasting, including, count them, 24 Emmys, which places him in the top all-time news Emmy winners in broadcast history. His report with the Washington Post on the opioid epidemic won more awards from 60 Minutes than any segment in the 52-year history of the show. We all know he was a producer for many years for the legendary newsman Mike Wallace, and we're going to be talking about that his experience with that quite a bit tonight. And then later, he was a producer for Steve Croft in between his two stints at 60 Minutes, long-term stints. He was at ABC's PrimeTime, which he helped to create, and 2020, where he worked with Chris Wallace and Diane Sawyers, among others. And he shares his stories in his fabulous new book, Ticking Clock, Behind the Scenes at 60 Minutes. And it is a wonderful, absolutely delightful and riveting read. So welcome, Ira. I'm so happy to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here tonight. Thank you.
Oh, it's so great. So listen, one of the things I want to talk about that I want to give our viewers a sense of this who may not have read the book yet is that before you landed your job at 60 Minutes at the young age of 26, you had actually had some incredible experiences and accomplishments that actually could have made a whole career for a lot of people. So I'm just going to highlight some of these because I just thought this was extraordinary when I read it. When you were at Cornell, you were the sports writer for the school paper. You uncovered a scandal about the basketball coach, and you were named Ivy League Writer of the Year. That story got you introduced to Peter Mass, who wrote Serpico, and he took you under his wing. And I think when you were still in college, actually, you were being invited to these parties with people like Nora Ephron, Pete Hamill, Tom Wolfe, Jimmy Breslin. After you graduated, you crisscrossed across the country at various news outlets, including Hustler, and you actually got fired by some of them along the way. And you ended up back in New York as a freelance writer with Rolling Stone. And it was when the 3 Mile incident happened that they asked you to go on assignment for that story. And joining you in that story was Mike Gray, who wrote The China Syndrome. And your story made the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, and you and Mike ended up writing a book on that. And then you were at Annie Nuke rally, where you actually spent an entire evening bar hopping with none other than Joni Mitchell. So, and that was all before you were 26. So I had to ask you, Ira, how did a kid from Queens feel about this at the time? Did you appreciate what you were experiencing?
I was, it was the middle of Watergate. Everybody wanted to be a reporter. Everyone wanted to be the next Woodward and Bernstein. And when I was in college, whatever I accomplished working for the Cornell Daily Sun, I had sent out 100 letters looking for jobs, and I got 98 rejections. And so I decided that it's much better to say you're hitchhiking to discover America than you're out of work. So I kind of hit the road. And while I was on the road, I wrote a freelance piece for the New York Times sports section about the art of sneaking into the best seats at baseball games and the ethics involved in moving up to a better seat if it's empty. And so while I was on the road, I discovered that they were going to print it at the end of October. And I said, wow, this is great. So I timed my arrival for one of those letters that said, if you're ever in town, give us a call. And that was the Sacramento Bee. And C.K. McClatchy was the publisher. So I hitchhiked into Sacramento on a Monday, and I take my backpack off in his office, and had a little unshaven beard. And I sit down, and we're having a discussion about where I've been and what I've seen. And then he said, do you have any recent writing samples with you? And I said, do you have yesterday's New York Times? And he said, yeah, it's right here. So I said, well, I have a story on the op-ed section of the sports section. And he opens it up and he reads it. And he said, you know, the cool thing about being a publisher is I can create a job when none exist. And so he kind of walked me out into the newsroom and said, give the kid a job. And so I was sent to Fresno, where I covered high school sports for a short period of time before being fired. Then I went to back east, and Larry Flint was trying to legitimize Hustler. He wanted it not to be a porn, so he hired all these legitimate writers. So they interviewed me, and they said, and so one of the people prepared me for the interview and wasn't quite your typical job interview. So I sit down with the editor, and he said, we got to make sure you're okay with us. I said, okay, go ahead. And he says, do you believe in UFOs? I said, well, it's crazy to think that all those pictures are phony. If one of them is true, it's the biggest story of our time. Who killed Kennedy? Well, it's clearly a combination of the mafia and CIA, and maybe in cahoots working together. It was clearly a conspiracy. And then he said, do you do drugs? And I kind of saw the way the interview was headed. And I said, of course. Great, you're perfect for us. So then they walked me in to meet with Flint, and he assured me they're going legit. And he had me meet with Ruth Carter Stapleton, who was then Jimmy Carter's sister, who was in his house at the time, who told me that he's going to be legit and all this stuff. So he says, okay, you're hired. I got a story for you. I said, what's that? He said, they're making human beings in Massachusetts without belly buttons and without souls. And I said, who? And he said, the CIA. And I said, I'll get right on it. Anyway, that job lasted about 2-3 months before he realized that there's no money to be made in not doing porn. So he went back to porn. He fired me. Anyway, long story short, I ended up working at WOR TV. And I did an on-air report about how easy it was to obtain military secrets. And it was a pretty good story. And Don Hewitt had seen it and he liked it. So he called my home. And at this point, I was bouncing around for jobs. I had no money. I moved back into the room I lived in when I was in high school. And the phone rings and my mom answers. My mom was a typical Jewish mother, and she answers, and Don Hewitt picks up and says, I'd like to talk to Ira Rosen. Oh, how are you? What's your name? Oh, Don Hewitt, you got a lovely wife. What are you doing? Oh, I'm making a kugel. Oh, a kugel. I haven't had a good kugel in a long time. And of course, I had tuned out the conversation. And he said, well, I'd like to see if your son is interested in being a producer on 60 Minutes. Oh, he's not interested. He's got a good job already. Thank you very much. And she hangs up. And I said, who is that?
She almost sabotaged your career there.
I said, who is that? And he said, oh, Don Hewitt. He wanted to offer you a job on 60 Minutes, but you have a job already. How many jobs do you need? So I quickly called Don back, and he says, kid, I don't know about you, but I like your mother. So if you don't want the job, tell her it's hers. But I wanted the job. So I went down to 60 Minutes' office and met with Don. And, I learned the art of storytelling. I used to work in the Catskill hotels. I was a tennis pro for a while, I was a waiter, I was a busboy, but whatever your job was, your duties at night were to work the spotlights in the nightclubs. So I worked the spotlights for, Henny Youngman, Red Buttons, Jackie Mason, Alan King, if people remember him. And I learned the art of storytelling from them. It's like, for example, Henny Youngman, take my wife, please, or I'm going to take my wife to a place she's never been before, the kitchen. Those stories have a beginning, middle, and end. There are a few words, and a lot is being conveyed to you in a short number of words. So I mentioned this to Don, and he said, that's where I learned it from too. And so we instantly bonded, and he walked me down the block to meet with Wallace. And that's the first time I heard that they wanted me to work with Mike Wallace. Mike did not want me to feel comfortable. He wanted me to feel uncomfortable. And so he asked me a question that is still one of the best questions I've ever been asked in my life. I know what I can do for you. What can you do for me? And I didn't have an answer because, I was bouncing around. I had less than 6 months of TV experience. And I said, I noticed he had a tennis ball in his office. I said, you play tennis? And he said, what's it to you? And I said, well, I was on the Cornell tennis team. And he said, well, he told me later if it didn't work out as a producer, he could get 6 months of tennis out of me before firing me. So that's how I got my job. He figured, get some tennis out of me, and and that's began the journey. And so the end of the story, of course, is then I call Mom, and this is after bouncing around and going job to job. I was just hired to be, at the time, the youngest producer in the history of 60 Minutes. And I called my mother, and I said, Mom, I'm going to be working for Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes. And without missing a beat, she said, Mike Wallace, he's so old. Why can't you work for Dan Rather?
Your mother was a hoot for sure. I just love that story. It was so funny when I read it in the book, and it was so great. But it also showed right from the beginning what's made you such a great investigative reporter and getting people to talk to you, because right away you noticed the tennis ball and you knew how to kind of hone into that. And this is one of your superpowers, I think. So many things I really loved about the book. And aside from some of the dishy information that we'll talk about, it's really a lesson in learning what really makes a great investigative reporter. And part of your job at 60 Minutes was to find the stories. And when you first start there, of course, the internet didn't exist. So you had very unusual ways for going out to find those stories. So tell us how you did that pre-internet.
There was something that I call airport roulette, where what I used to do, and again, it's hard to explain this in a world where the internet didn't exist, but 60-minute producers used to get newspapers sent to them, from Akron, from Cincinnati, and they piled up on your couch, and nobody really had time to go through it every single day. And you were competing against the other producers. So whoever found the story first got the story. It wasn't based on merit. It was a kind of a quick claim deed on a story, and it's called a blue sheet. So if you blue sheeted the story first, it was yours. It didn't matter if you're at the bottom of the totem pole, if you have 50 years of experience. Sorry, Charlie, he blue sheeted it first, and he gets it. So in order to beat the system, I used to do something called airport roulette, which was going to an airport, throwing my credit card down and saying next flight out. And the next flight, even if it took you to Cincinnati and the one after took you to LA, a more fun city, you go to Cincinnati because was the karma of the chase. And when you get to Cincinnati, you then go through all the local newspapers of that day. If there's a worthy 60-minute story, you stay and make a few phone calls. If not, back to the counter and you do it all over again. After about 3 days of bouncing around the country, you usually found a pretty good story that was, out of the box, and you did it before anyone else on the show.
That's amazing. I mean, really to think about that now. We all of us on this call, believe me, we're old enough to remember pre-internet days, but I think kids today would find that so incredible that was how you found stories. So let's talk about Mike Wallace now, because you were his producer for many, many years, and we all know he was a really brilliant interviewer, but he had a really dark side too, and he was a really abusive boss. So tell us about the Mike Wallace that you knew, and you also produced some huge stories with him too. So I'd love your thoughts on some of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was 26, and I kind of made a bargain with myself that I'm going to learn the art form from this genius of television. I mean, it was talk about being next to a giant. I mean, I suppose people who were artists' apprentice for Picasso or those people, had to endure various abuses as well. But Mike had an incredible short temper. He verbally harassed people. In my first story, I was assigned to do a story with another producer, and one of the interviews fell through, and we picked Mike up at the airport, and he gets in the car, and the producer I was working with tells Mike, this interview had fallen through. So Mike starts to rip open the guy's briefcase, take out documents, throw it at him, saying you're a total failure. We're going to fire you as soon as you get back to New York. And it was the most astonishing verbal harassment I had ever seen. And later I got a drink with that producer at the bar. We put Mike into his room, and I said, how can you take that? And he said, take what? I said, take that, abuse and the screaming. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, you didn't hear what he was saying? He said, I go into a cone of silence. I don't hear any of it. And if I would listen to it, it would destroy me. And I would discover later that, the producers on a show all suffered from various ailments. Some got prematurely lost their hair. One had an ulcer that he nicknamed Myron, which was Mike's real name, Myron Wallace. So his ulcer was named Myron. In my case, my back had gone out for most of the time I was with him. I used to sleep on hotel room floors in order to deal with the pain of my back. And I remember the next story I did, I was on my own. And again, an interview had fallen through, and Mike started to do the same thing with me, ripping my briefcase open, throwing papers at me. And I started doing a Buddhist chant in order to kind of block him out, trying to create my own cone of silence. And we get to the next, the story was about school violence in LA. And we get to the next interview, and the next interview also is going south. It's just not going well. So I don't smoke, but I took a cigarette from one of the cameramen and I went outside and I started smoking and started thinking about maybe I should just stay out in LA and start looking for another job. And I noticed that kids were standing around, and I played a hunch. And I said, how many people here have gotten stabbed in school? So 3 hands raised. I said, how many people did the stabbing? 1 hand raised. I said, okay, you guys come over here. Then Wallace emerges from the interview looking like he wanted to fire me on the spot. So I said to him, ask the kids who got stabbed in school, who did the stabbing, and follow your instincts. And sure enough, after he finished with the victims, he went to the kid who did the stabbing, and he said, you put a knife in a person's belly, you twisted it around. How old are you? And he said, 16 years old. Does that make you feel like a big man? You're nothing but a punk. It was classic Mike Wallace. Anyway, we get back into the car. We're driving up the hill towards the Beverly Hills Hotel where we stayed. And a minute or two goes by, and he said, you saved your ass tonight. I said, I know. And that was our entire conversation. And that was my first test of producing. But, he was, as we say in the business, he was hard on the furniture.
And he also suffered from depression too. I know you talk about
Right.
that in the book, right?
Right. And we were not aware of what was going on at the time. It was a secret he kept. And I think doctors at the time told him, don't talk about your depression because it'll hurt your career. At that point in time, there was a certain stigma to having depression. Interestingly enough, his two friends, two of his closest friends also suffered from depression, including Art Buchwald. And so, they knew about the disease. And we were on a shoot, and we were going to a prison in Pennsylvania, Lewisburg Federal Prison. And, he starts punching the window and his hand gets all bloody. And, I was scared, and I didn't know what to do. But he told me to keep driving on. We went to the prison. He, of course, did a classic interview. We get back in the car, and on the way back to the Harrisburg airport, he asked me to pull over to the side, and he froze up. And he says, don't tell anyone at the office about this. Okay. The next shoot we had was with this guy, Arkady Shivchenko, who was a Russian diplomat who was really secretly working for the CIA. And we did the interview, and the piece airs. And that Sunday night, he calls me up, and the way there's never a hello, how are you, how's life? You know, it starts immediately with just conversation. And the conversation was, kid, I saw the piece, I was there for the piece, but I don't remember doing the piece. And the next day he checked himself into the hospital. And what's so interesting about Mike's depression issue is that as a journalist, you're always trying to affect change. You're always trying to do something that makes the world a better place. And Mike, in exposing his own illness and talking about it, did more to help people than almost any story he ever worked on. He would show me the piles of letters that he would get from people who suffered from depression and were encouraged by Mike going public with it to deal with their own depression issues and realizing that it's not a stigma, that it's something that they kind of need to deal with and address.
Yeah, well, that was a really brave thing he did at the time, because you're right, people weren't really talking about that. So I think he really did help to shine a light on a lot of important topics. So you did so many major stories with him. What are one or two that stand out to you that you did with Mike?
Well, the story, there were two. I have to sort of say there are two. One was with Edward Teller. Edward Teller was the inventor of the H-bomb. And we went to Moscow as part of that story to interview Arkady Shivchenko. And I'm sorry, not Arkady, Sakharov, Andrei Sakharov, and who was the inventor of the H-bomb in Russia. And when we get there, he was living in a flat in Moscow, and Elena Bonner, his wife, answers the door. And what I found so interesting and stayed with me was that there was always a little party going on in the Sakharov's house. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Even though he was a dissident, the Russians wouldn't dare touch him. And so all the other dissidents in the town felt safe to go there and to have meetings and to have conversations. And there was something very wonderful about that experience. And, and so we bring Sakharov out, and Elena Bonner sort of shakes a finger at us and says, you make sure he's back by 3 o'clock because I leave. We only have one key, which I found interesting. So we go off site and we do the interview with Sakharov, and in Mike Wallace's terms, he came to play. And he told us about how the Russians had gathered, would go out into the snows of Siberia after a US nuclear test and gather the fallout from the bombs. And then after they would gather the fallout that landed in the snow, they would able to break down how the US bombs were made. And that gave them clues on how to build their own bomb. And it was a great interview. And afterwards, of course, him and Mike decided to take a walk in Red Square. And I'm saying, we got to bring him back before 3 o'clock. And of course, Mike loves that type of thing. And he says, oh, stop, you're not going to let her push you around. And so, of course, we bring him back at like 3:45, and he had been locked out the door. And Elena Bonner is not someone you mess with. And so, he then sat out there, and that was the last we saw of Sakharov. He ended up dying a year later, but then we went back to the US, and now we're doing Edward Teller. And Teller, before we did the interview, every time I would ask him a question, he would say, where in my book is that written? He had written a book, a memoir, and I would not have the answer. And he said, well, I'm not going to answer it until you could tell me where in the book it is. And then he would begin every answer with, as I've said on page 45 of my book. And then he would go, it was a disastrous scenario. And finally, Mike had said, no, let's do the interview with him. So what I did was I put the microphone thread through the chair and through his shirt, so that if he would get up and leave, because Mike asked him some question that's not from the book, he would literally have to try to figure out how to take the microphone off. So sure enough, Mike asked him a story about Albert Einstein that didn't come from the book. And so Teller sits there in stony silence, doesn't say anything. And Mike says, Dr. Teller. And then he says, I think we've had enough. But he couldn't figure out how to. So I'm sitting there fascinated how this guy could build the H-bomb, but can't figure out how to put the microphone on the shirt. And that story, stayed with me just because of the characters of it all. And then the other one was, which we did a story about Richard Miller, who was an FBI agent who turned into a Russian spy, who had a affair with this Russian agent. And what I remembered about the story was how it all fell in place. The guy sat down and was willing to admit that he was a total buffoon. Mike was at the top of his game. The Russian agent amazingly agreed to go on camera. And Mike, Mike flirted with her and was, got her to admit a lot of things on camera. But both of Mike and I, during that story, were at the top of our games. We both were, if you will, at the height of our powers. And that story would lead the season, be in the season's premiere. And it was a very satisfying thing where it's kind of like a baseball team when two hitters are both in a groove. And that story, more than any other I did with Mike, was when both of us were in our groove. We were both at the height of our powers, if you will.
Wow, that's a great way to describe it. So I want to talk about a story that's on page 35 of your book. Actually, I'm not sure what page it's on, but very early on, one of the things that I love in your book that I know made you so great at your job is you're just very good about friending people. And you have some people, I would call them sort of the unlikely friendships. And one of those that happened very early on when you were at 60 Minutes was with Marlon Brando. So tell us about that. That's a great story.
Yeah, I had just finished doing a profile of Joe Bonanno, the head of organized crime, and I wanted to use a little bit of The Godfather. Normally, you just call the studio and they say yes. So one day out of the blue, Brando calls me. And I thought it was a joke at first, but it was really Brando, and he wanted to know how we're going to use the film. And I told him, and it was okay by Joe. And he and I then began, many months long relationship on the phone where he would call me out of the blue and start talking Yiddish to me. His teacher was Stella Adler, and who had taught him. So he had, kind of a very rudimentary sense of Yiddish. And then I'd call him up on his birthday. Both of us were born on the same day, April 3rd. And I'd say, Marlon, happy birthday. And he said, what is it with birthdays? Birds don't celebrate birthdays. Trees don't celebrate birthdays. Animals. And I said, Marlon, we're better than them. He said, says who? And I said, I'm going to do nothing special today. And so I said, oh boy. So then another time he called me up and he said, you ever know like famous people who have great reputations or real assholes? He said, Charlie Chaplin, great reputation, total asshole. William Saroyan, the writer, great reputation, total asshole. And at that time, I had somebody waiting for me at a restaurant I needed to go meet. And he, of course, ignored that. And there's no internet and no can't text or anything. So he starts reading me Saroyan. So I had a choice: meet my friend at a bar or listen to Marlon Brando read Saroyan. And of course, I stayed to listen to this amazing private reading, which filled my soul at that moment in time. And then just as the conversation began, he abruptly hangs up. And so a few months go by and we finally agree to get a meeting going on. And we go out to LA, and Mike is with me, and he picks us up at a white Rolls Royce, and he's wearing a white suit. And Mike gets into the front seat. And the aim here was to get him to go on camera. He was a recluse at the time, and he hadn't done, I don't think he had ever done a TV interview for many years. And we were working him. And so we get it in the car and we're driving down Mulholland, and Marlon is running every single red light. And I said, Marlon, what are you doing? And he said, you're gonna let a machine tell you what to do? Be a man. And so I said, Marlon, I had to get there alive. No, he didn't. He just ran every red light. We get to the restaurant, and so he sits down and he starts with Mike, and he said, Mike, I've admired your acting ability for years. The raised eyebrow, the look of astonishment. you're a master actor. And Mike says, I'm not an actor, I'm a journalist. Oh, stop it. You're an incredible actor. I can't even duplicate what you do on camera. And then Mike decides enough of this conversation. So he says to him, how did you get so fat? And Brando says, well, I go to Baskin and Robbins. I can't decide what flavor I want. So I ask for a quarter of every flavor they have, and I bring it home and I end up eating them all. At which point Mike says, you know what? I'm 66 or whatever, 67. I don't need to show America what an asshole you are. Why don't we just be friends? At which point I give Mike a swift kick under the table. Like, what are you doing? And Marlon says, oh, that's great. Now I can relax. Anyway, we never got the interview, but I had one final conversation with Brando. And we're talking, and he says, you play the stock market? I said, a little bit, not much. And he said, well, let me give you a tip. I said, what is it? He said, Apple. I said, I never heard of it before. He said, buy it. I'm telling you, it's going to be a good company. I said, all right, fine. And then I go tell Wallace. And I said, I just had this conversation, and Brando mentioned this company, Apple. And Mike says, you're going to buy the stock. I said, are you crazy? Why would I take a stock tip from a guy who can't decide what flavor ice cream he wants? So needless to say, that's one that got away in many ways,
That's a great story. And it kept you working for a lot more years too.
Probably.
So let's talk a little bit now about the culture at 60 Minutes, because we know that years later, CBS and 60 Minutes got caught in the whole Me Too movement, which you describe as a culture of abuse and sexual harassment that actually went back for years. I mean, you saw it for a lot of years. So tell us what that culture was like. And in some ways, I think if a lot of us think back to, many of us were in corporate America in those years too.
Sure.
It probably happened in, many of us experienced that in a lot of big corporations. But what did you see there?
Well, I mean, as I wrote in the book, Mike was an abuser. I mean, there's no nice way to put it. He would snap women's bra straps in the office. He didn't think twice about, smacking a person in their behind. In fact, I was talking to one woman who was a victim of him, and she called me up, and she actually thanked me for putting that story. I didn't mention her name in the book, though she told me later she would be okay with it, but I'm not going to do it. But when he did that to her, she turned and slapped him, and Mike's reaction was, "What the hell is her problem?" And that stayed with me. I was like, "What did just happen?" And there was nobody who really stopped that and called attention to it. People turned a blind eye. The women who were the victims. I think some of them just left Mike either to work with other correspondents or maybe left the show. I mean, it was a really horrible and wrong way to behave. And as I sort of said at the very end, I'm not sure if I was a woman who was 26 years old who was getting her bra strap snapped by Mike Wallace, whether I would have stayed in television. But it's come a long way. I think the Me Too movement has been fantastic. It has, there's more to be done. And I think things are really getting better in that regard. They're not there yet. They're getting better. I commend those who had the courage to finally come forward.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And so now I want to go back now to your role as a producer, because not only is your job finding stories and exposés, but it's getting people and also sources, but getting people who are often very reluctant to want to come on camera and be interviewed. But you've been absolutely brilliant at this. So you courted people. So tell us a little bit about how you go about getting people who don't want to get interviewed to come on.
Part of it is, people, Mike taught me a lot of this, but some I learned on my own. People feel first that they could outsmart you, that they could do better than they think they can. They don't know, per se, if it's a confrontational interview, they don't know what maybe you have in your back pocket. And Mike used to do something where he called it creating an air of confidentiality between two people. Mike used to say sometimes between you and I. Of course, it was between you and I and 30 million people. But the way I did it was I would just get to, play the long game. I would be with them for years. John Gotti Jr., for example, took me 4 years to get on front of the camera. And I first went down to the courthouse where he was on trial in the Southern District. And he tells the story where he sees me for the first time and I'm winking at him. And he turns to his attorney, he said, "Who's that guy winking?" And he said, "Oh, that's the 60-minute producer. He wants to do an interview with me." He said, "One, I'm not doing no interview with no 60 minutes. And two, I'm not doing an interview with anybody who winks at me. I haven't been in jail that long. Some guy is going to make a..." And as John tells it, I stopped winking and I started courting him like a bride, is the way he put it. And so I used to go out to Long Island and just have dinner with him or lunch with him and, schmooze with him and tell stories and break balls and, hear all the stuff until one day, about 3 or 4 years into the process, I'm sitting with John and Charlie Carnesi, his late attorney, and this guy, Tony, who just said one word at dinner called flounder, which is what he ordered for dinner. And the rest of the time he just stared at me. And we're talking and John starts talking about his kids and his family. And at the end of the dinner, we walk out and Tony then comes up to me and John, everybody kisses each other. They're very big into kissing on cheeks. And so after all the kissing was over with, Tony comes up to me and he says, "You're in." I said, what do you mean I'm in?" He said, "John doesn't talk about his family unless he felt comfortable with you. So he said, you're in. So when do you want to do this?" And that's kind of how the Gotti interview happened. The other one, which took a long time, was an interview I did with Steve Bannon, who was the senior advisor to President Trump. And I had gotten to know Steve through a mutual friend. And we would have, occasional breakfasts and be listening to his rants and craziness. And then one day he calls me up and we have breakfast. And I hadn't seen him in about 6 months, maybe longer. And he shows up at breakfast wearing an army flak jacket, a beard, kind of hair that didn't look like it had been washed for a few days. And he sits down and he said, "I'm going to be running the Donald Trump campaign." And there was so much wrong with this picture. Here is this guy who looked like, a derelict sitting in front of me that he's saying that he's running a presidential campaign for another person who didn't even know what he was doing at that time. Whatever your politics are, there is no way that Trump at that point in time could ever be thought of as a presidential candidate. And then, as the process happened, Trump got elected, and then I would fly down on Saturdays to the White House, and I would be hanging out in the West Wing with Bannon. And again, it's the long game, it's the courtship. And so you sit there and you listen to him, and Jared would be observing the Sabbath, and Priebus, who was the chief of staff at the time, would have date night with the wife. And so we had the West Wing to ourselves. And so we would just sit there. He didn't drink alcohol, so we drank Diet Cokes. And we would just sit there and talk, and he'd download with me. And then eventually we moved it over to his apartment behind the Supreme Court called the Embassy. And we would just be there. And I tell all this in the book.
Yeah, and your description of his apartment was pretty interesting too.
Oh yeah, no, it looked like, you didn't realize anybody lived there until you saw the clothes hangers of shirts that delivered by the dry cleaners, I guess. But it was what you do is you just take in the information, you keep it, and I was headed towards getting him on 60 Minutes. And that was the end game. And sure enough, I knew he was going to get fired. It was just a matter of when. And sure enough, about 1 year into his tenure with Trump, he got fired. And when he got fired, we ended up doing the interview within a month his firing, and it became a classic 60 Minutes. It was two parts. Beginning of the 50th season of 60 Minutes, it led the season. It was a very, very important story for the show, and frankly, for the country to hear Bannon for the first time.
Well, obviously you've been so successful about, building up trust with people, and also not betraying those trusts when you have promised people you wouldn't, and you see that throughout the book too. And then some of these people you really did become friends. I mean, it seems like you really have a real friendship with John Gotti Jr. I know you said he spoke at your retirement party. I thought that was great.
No, I mean, Leslie Stoll and Bill Whitaker throws a party for me at the Harvard Club, and it was basically 60 Minutes people, but I invited one non-60 Minutes person, which was Gotti. And Gotti delivered the toast, which to this day people still talk about. And because all these 60-minute producers, they expected, I don't know who they expected to be there, but suddenly Gotti pops up there, and he's like, John Gotti is delivering his toast here. But Gotti said, my father said that life is about creating memories, and at the end of the day, that's all you got. And here tonight, you have created so many memories, and all these people love you. And it's great. I was just such a warm and incredible toast that everybody just shook their head. And it's like, wow, that's pretty incredible. But he's a guy who taught me, about his business, if you will. Not giving away any confidences or revealing anything that would put anyone in jail, but he taught me the business the way, in some ways, that Mike Wallace taught me TV, and I learned from him. And when you're with a person like that, you just have to sort of absorb what they're telling you, so that you could translate it into other work and other stories. It gives you an understanding. I mean, one of the things that has always been very important to me is to go against the main narrative that's in the media. So I did a story on the NSA, and it was right after Snowden. I did it with John Miller, who's now head of terrorism for New York. And when I did the story, the narrative was the NSA is a bad place, and they're doing us harm. They're taking all our phone records, and they're spying on all Americans. And the press embraced the Snowden narrative. And so the NSA invited us in to basically see what they're about. And, I came away from the experience feeling that, they are trying to protect America, that they are collecting information, but they're not using it in a nefarious way. They kind of put it in a lockbox, so that a terrorist, comes into their radar, they don't have to go to the phone companies to try to get the records, or worry that the phone companies have destroyed those records and they won't be able to retrieve them again. So they kind of put them in a lockbox for the day that they need them. And I never saw a single example that any of the spying that they did resulted in any harm to any US citizen. One NSA guy kind of reprogrammed the satellite to spy on an ex-girlfriend. To find out what she was up to. But that was about it. And so we did that story, and there was immediate backlash. We were roundly attacked. We were up and down the aisle. To the credit of the people at 60 Minutes, they stuck with us and they supported us. And, that's the cool thing about it, which is if the journalism is there and the reporting is backing it up, you will get the support.
Well, I love that, because it sounds like you were always looking for the truth, as opposed to trying to prove what the narrative was out there.
Well, yeah, people think, for example, we have, agendas. Yes, I have my political beliefs, and I know what my political beliefs are. But that didn't stop me from having Senator Coburn of Oklahoma being a very close friend. And Senator Coburn was one of the most conservative senators in the Senate. And, and as I wrote in my book, we both want to change the world, but we have different ways of getting there. And, so it allowed for a common ground to happen. He thought global warming, for example, was a hoax. He believed the science showed that, the earth constantly changes, and this is part of the planetary systems of, one time it's 1 degree higher, 1 degree lower. And he and I would have furious fights about this sort of thing. But it was all as friends. It was all as two people, having just a good, strong intellectual argument. And unfortunately, on TV right now, either you're a righty or you're a lefty, and depending on your viewpoint, you'll tune into CNN or MSNBC, or you'll turn into Fox. And you're not having that kind of conversation that Coburn and I used to have.
Ira, it's not just the news; it's in our everyday lives now. So that's
Sure.
sad that we can't have conversations anymore where we can have opposing points of view and actually have a conversation. So I hope at some point we're able to get back at that. But I want to talk to you about your time when you left 60 Minutes and you went to PrimeTime in 2020, and you actually became a producer for Chris Wallace. And I know you sometimes had an abusive relationship with Mike, but he and Chris didn't have a very good relationship either. So just tell us a little bit more about that and what Chris was like.
Well, I actually had great admiration for Chris. Chris is incredibly smart. And interestingly enough, that, the entire time I was with Chris, he we worked with his father a long time. But there was once where Chris was excited. He was going to do an interview with Chris Rock, the comedian. So he was about to do the interview, and Mike Wallace basically steals it from him. And he calls me up and he said, "This is it. This is an outrage. How can he do this?" And I said, "I can't believe Mike knowingly took it from you." He said, "No, he did. He knew it was me and he took it from me." So I called up Mike Wallace, and I said, and again, in typical conversation, you don't say hello, you just start talking. And I said, "Are you doing Chris Rock?" And he said, "What's it to you?" And I said, "Well, your son was about to do the interview and you're ripping your kid off." He said, "He'll get over it." I said, "Mike, you got a choice. Here's the deal. Either Chris will speak at your funeral, or you could do Chris Rock. You can't do both." Pause. "Let me get back to you." So sure enough, Mike calls me back and he said, "I solved the problem." I said, "How did you solve the problem?" He said, "I gave it to Bradley." I said, "Mike, you're still ripping your kid off. What are you talking about?" He said, "What are you talking about? I'm not doing it. Bradley's going to do it." Anyway, Chris and Mike didn't talk for a period of time, but Chris actually did speak at the funeral, and he told that story at Mike's funeral. And the point when Chris told it was, as infuriating as my father was, there was still something that I absolutely loved about him, that I wanted to spend every single moment I could with this man who just drove me crazy. And in many ways, that's the way I felt. Because at the end of this extraordinary journey I had with Mike and his family and his insanities and his abuse, at the very, very end, he got softer, and he had basically been forced out of 60 Minutes. He had an operation that left him diminished mentally, and in the end, he was in a nursing home, and he didn't remember that he had worked at 60 Minutes. He had forgotten. And there was an extraordinary sadness to it. And the only thing, and I was there and I was trying to remind him of the stories we did. And he kept saying, "Yep, yep, yep," but he really didn't remember any of them. And the one thing he did remember was playing tennis with me and drop shotting me in tennis and seeing me run into the net and fall on my face or whatever. And at the end of days, this extraordinary man with this extraordinary career and having been at the center of so many of the planet's most important events had no memory of any of it. And that left me with an enormous sadness, which is why I wrote The Ticking Clock, because, I wanted the memories of those experiences that I went through to be there on a piece of paper. And people ask me a lot sometimes, how can you take it? How did you take all this abuse? I mean, it was a choice I made. It was a choice I made at that point in time to learn the business, to be able to be given this opportunity. And as I said in the book, I felt it was, in a weird way, right or wrong, and people could judge it the way they want to judge it. I felt it was part of my job description in a weird way to find stories, edit the stories, write the question, and get beaten up by Mike Wallace. I mean, this is all part of it. Certainly now the world has changed, and there's outlets for us to sort of report this sort of behavior, but that was not happening back then.
Well, it's so great. I'm so glad that you talked about that, because you did have a complex relationship with a very complex man, and that's really the heart of the book. And I just want to mention, there's been so many headlines taken from your book from reviewers who've talked about the Katie Couric comment and Diane Sawyer's, and to me they were like little footnotes in your book, and I'm so glad that we've gotten to talk about really the heart and soul of it. So I don't know if you want to mention those or not. People can just read the book and make their own judgment there.
I tried to, there's a lot of very, very positive things I said about all of those people.
Yes.
But, as it happens in the tabloids, when the tabloids get a hold of your book, they pull out the 3 words here and 3 words there, and I'm not going to use fake media, but, let people read the book for themselves and determine it's, the book is so much more substantive about it. And so that's why I wrote this. And so there's good and bad. I mean, we all have good and bad. I reveal things, good and bad about myself as well. I mean, there's good and bad in everybody. So I didn't spare myself, and in some ways I didn't spare some people in the book. I do want to say, though, that my 2 favorite correspondents, because I know you were going to ask me about this, but I know we're about to run out of time, and I can't stop without mentioning, is Bill Whitaker and Leslie Stoll. And I was so fortunate at the very end to work with both of them. And not only were they both extraordinary journalists, Leslie is just an extraordinarily wonderful person. She's a great interviewer. She has a husband who's ill, who she makes sure whatever she's doing, she leaves work at 5 o'clock and spends time with him. She's a dedicated mother. And she taught me a lot about having a complete life. And Bill Whitaker is likewise just a sponge in terms of being able to gather information, and then in his own way, a very non-Mike Wallace way, but in his own style and his own way of doing things, creates extraordinary interviews. We did a series on the opiate epidemics, which was the most award-winning piece in the history of 60 Minutes. And I don't think it would have won a single award had it not been for Bill Whitaker's brilliance at drawing out those interviews that we did. So, I just wanted to say a final word on those 2. And I want to thank you so much for hosting tonight.
I want to thank you. It's been such a pleasure. And I'm so glad you mentioned that last story, because it was such an important one. And I know towards the end of your book, when you were talking about that story, you said what reporters love to do is to help make the world a better place through your stories. And you have certainly done that, Ira Rosen, through your whole career. So I think it's been so amazing. So listen, everyone who's here, if you have not bought the book yet, we've only touched the surface tonight. Believe me, there's so much more. You talked about Steve Bannon, but he talked about having Trump removed from office for dementia. Giselle Maxwell's comments on Jeffrey Epstein's alleged secret tapes with Clinton and Trump, and her outrageous offer to Ira. why former President Jimmy Carter failed to get the government's UFO files released and the person who blocked them, and then details of Melania Trump's post-nuptial deal that was negotiated after the 2016 presidential election. And there's so much more. So we just thank you enough. Everyone go get the book. You're just such an impressive guy. I'll say that again. Your wife can hear it. He's impressive.
Thank
So
you.
thank you so much for being here today. I really
Thanks for having me.
All right.